So, James, the stock market's been taking some pretty wild swings lately. I think the latest is that the S&P 500 is down about 9% in the last month or so. Do you think the US is headed towards a recession?
It's always a lot of I think popular to conflate economic performance with the stock market performance, and the reality is those two are not in any way the same. There's a lot of places around the world, there's countries around the world that have virtually no economy to speak of whatsoever, and that their stock markets soar. I mean, they keep going through the roof. I mean, there was times when Argentina, for example, was just in the absolute dumps and had horrible, horrible inflation. And yet the stock market kept going higher and higher. Stock market and the economy don't have to be connected at all. It can be massive disconnects.
Well,
Similar
can
to their
inflation actually cause some of that as well? If there's massive inflation, does a lot
Oh,
of that just
sure.
flow into the?
Yeah, a lot of that flows in the stock market. People buy real estate. I mean, I saw this, for example, in South Africa. The economy for so long has been in the dumps, and yet people would take their money and they would buy real estate, they'd buy stocks as a hedge against a falling currency. So you can have an economy that's absolutely in the dumps and the stock market's going higher. You can have an economy that's performing reasonably well and its stock market goes nowhere, right? I mean, there's plenty of place in the world where stock markets are undervalued, stock markets are overvalued relative to an economy, relative to GDP growth. So there doesn't really have to be any correlation at all between the two. And I think it's easy to conflate the market performance and economic performance, but they're really not the same thing. I think with respect to the U.S. economy and the U.S. stock market, there is some level of correlation, and I think in part because the U.S. economy depends so heavily on consumer spending, which is unusual compared to a lot of other economies. There are a lot of economies that really depend very heavily on production or remittances, exports, various different things. The U.S. economy is very consumption focused, and in large part because of the inflation that the U.S. economy and U.S. consumers have experienced over the past few years, most of that consumption now, the biggest chunk of that consumption is basically being handled by the top 10% of U.S. income earners, U.S. consumers, because most other people are just still struggling to make ends meet because prices are still so high. And granted, the rate at which prices have been increasing, the rate of inflation has come down, but prices are still going up, not as fast as they were. So consumers sort of starting to recover a little bit from at least the pain that from 2022 and 2023. But it basically has left the top earners, people that have combined household incomes, two professionals at home working that, combined might make a couple $100,000 a year. And they're actually responsible for the majority of consumer spending, which drives the economy. The thing about those particular households, higher income households, those are also people that are investing in the market. And so when the stock market declines, they'll feel when they see the price of their Nvidia stock go through the roof, or they see the price of their Tesla stock go through the roof, it makes them feel wealthier, right? Even if they haven't actually sold, they haven't actually deposited they haven't realized those gains, locked in some of those profits, they just, you feel wealthier. And I think this is absolutely true. I think a lot of people experience this. You find out your house is worth a lot more than what you paid, or certain investments. I do a lot of private investments, and I call up the management and the CEOs and go, oh, we just locked in this, huge contract or whatever. Like, I haven't actually sold anything. I haven't actually put any money in my pocket, but I feel a lot more optimistic. Sure. I feel a lot more optimistic.
And you go out to dinner, or you buy a new car, or is that?
Well, I mean, no, I'm not. Sometimes, yeah. I mean, I don't usually make like major purchases so frivolously, but I mean, I think that I do think that leads to a certain sense of optimism, and that optimism creates stronger consumer sentiment. When people look at their brokerage account, they look at the value of their homes and these sorts of things, they see bigger and bigger numbers. Yeah, sure. That's going to help consumer sentiment, and that will drive economic growth. And so now,
almost sounds like a tax on unrealized gains. People are going to go out and spend it before they've realized the gains, and they're going to pay all sorts of other taxes on that.
Well, it's actually kind of the opposite when you think about it. It's almost the argument to not have wealth taxes, because when people feel wealthier, when you tax, I mean, taxing people on unrealized gains is the dumbest idea of pretty much all tax ideas. And there's a lot of stupid tax ideas out there. I mean, like exit taxes and these sorts of things, just horrible, horrible ideas. Taxing unrealized gains has probably got to be one of the dumbest things that a politician could advocate for, because all it proves is that they have no financial literacy whatsoever. It's virtually impossible to tax somebody across the board on unrealized gains because so many unrealized gains are actually illiquid. How do you tax somebody that owns like a mom and pop family business? How do you tax, real estate on
And
unrealized
also
gains? It's
just the
just
mess that would be to try to, oh, and then you get a credit if it goes down, and the bureaucratic nightmare to try to
having to
comply
track
with
all of
that.
that. The only guys that win are the lawyers and the accountants,
Ugh.
who then would get to spin up all their new businesses tracking, asset values and all these things. And then some tech entrepreneur would come along and create some AI thing to do it and put all the lawyers and the accountants out of business and all that sort of
But
stuff. But I mean, like, it's an industry that doesn't need to exist is the
totally
bottom line.
unproductive, which is
Right.
actually kind of part of the point that we're
Part of the point.
talking about, right? Is
Right.
that what is going to be productive in the economy? And a lot of these government workers that are getting fired, for example, is that is that going to cut the productivity of America?
Uh, no, it should in the long run enhance the productivity of America. And so that's I think kind of the basic idea is that the stock market for such a long time is now starting, it had ignored any possibility of a recession or any kind of economic decline. Back in 2022, I mean, this is like one of the most disingenuous things ever, and another indictment of the expert class. We, all of us, remember the pain of 2022, 2023, inflation peaking at 9%. And that's based on the government's sort of monkey gorilla math that isn't even real. The real rates of inflation were much, much higher. The pain that most people were feeling, anybody that went to the grocery store, which is pretty much everybody, filled up their car, daycare, university tuition, all this stuff is just going through the roof. At the same time, you had multiple consecutive quarters of a decline in overall U.S. economic output. On any planet, anywhere else in the universe, that's a recession. That's actually not even a recession. That's stagflation. But the experts said, no, 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 that's not a recession. We're not calling it a recession. So how you feel as an individual, as a consumer, you go, my life is shit. This is getting so much worse for me. That didn't matter. Your opinion
Didn't
didn't
the
matter.
Biden administration actually come out and say, they're like, well, we're not considering that the definition anymore? They said part of the definition is when the experts tell you that there's
Right.
a recession.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's basically this sort of like council of economists that get together, and the experts decide whether or not it's a recession. And so, they didn't put it on the books as a recession, this kind of period in 2022, 2023, but everybody felt it. Everybody felt it. And they insisted that it wasn't a recession because the unemployment rate didn't skyrocket. Well, it turns out, if you actually go back and look at all the data, the reason why the unemployment rate didn't skyrocket is because the frickin' government was hiring so many people. And if you looked at the job reports over the past couple of years, one of the biggest drivers of employment growth was at the government level. And that does not create a prosperous economy. Right. So
you can actually look at it through the math, right? When you see the government is spending deficit spending, going into debt, and then the GDP doesn't grow by that same amount, has their investment actually done anything?
Right. I mean, you go, okay, great. We're going to dump all this money into the economy. We're going to go into debt to do so. We're going to go into debt $2 trillion, but we only get $1 trillion in economic growth. $2 trillion in debt, $1.5 trillion in economic growth. So what exactly is the point? That's a terrible return on investment. You're getting worse and worse and worse every year. We're going to keep indebting ourselves $2 trillion and only get 1.5. You would think you'd get at least 1-to-1. You'd think if you're going to spend $2 trillion, you're going to get $2 trillion in economic growth, but somehow they just, $500 billion just vanishes into thin air, and they can't even account for it in the economic growth numbers. And so this is just the surest sign ever that the federal government needs to get out of the business of trying to grow the economy, do anything with the economy. They just need to really do the minimum amount possible. And I think this is kind of part of the reason why, these guys, I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, there's the uncertainty, obviously the trade wars, the tariffs, which, I mean, we've said are just really stupid ideas. I'm willing to acknowledge that maybe there's other reasons behind it. Maybe these guys are really maybe they're really smart guys and they're playing 4D chess and they're trying to get other things in terms of border security and I mean, I don't know. Well, I do know that tariffs are a really, really bad idea. and they actually will make the economy much worse. And I think the both markets and consumers and really businesses and investors and everybody's starting to respond to that. We're starting to see that in the stock market numbers. And in that respect, it's not a disconnect between the market and the economy. It's not a disconnect at all.
So, what does a stronger stock market make the economy better in any way, or are those even
Well, yeah, like
connected?
I said, I think in the U.S., if you go back in time to the big crashes, 1929, the average person didn't own stocks. If you go back to 1987, huge crash in the United States in 1987, the average guy, stock market was the plaything of very wealthy people. If you were a doctor and a lawyer and a, business executive, these sorts of things, you owned stocks. But the average person didn't own stocks. That didn't start becoming a thing until the 90s and the tech boom. And suddenly you had these online brokerage accounts and people were, able to start doing some of those things. And you get by 2008, the 2008 crash, you had a lot more people that were invested in the market. Today, you have a lot more people, average regular consumers, people in the middle class, lower middle class, and people invest in the market. Even if they don't do it directly, they've got some kind of maybe a 401k or something like that that's heavily invested in the market. And even again, that didn't used to be that way. You go back to the 80s when government bonds in the United States were paying 12, 15, 16% interest. People would just buy government bonds. I mean, why take the risk in the stock market when you can get 15%, loaning money to Ronald Reagan? That was a much better deal, right? So today you can't do that. I mean, you get 4%. And so, versus 4% with the U.S. government indebted up to its eyeballs, $36 trillion in debt versus, people go and buy NVIDIA stock that they think is going to go higher and higher and higher every single day. So more and more people invest in stocks. And that does create this thing called the wealth effect. When the stock market goes up, people do feel wealthier. And if they feel wealthier, that does eventually kind of make its way into consumer spending. They feel better, they feel more optimistic, and it makes them a little bit less miserly when it comes to spending their money. Even if they haven't even realized the gains yet from the market, they'll go and spend that money, and that does obviously have an impact in an economy, especially one like the United States that is so consumer driven.
You said that the higher interest rates on government bonds was actually drawing investment from the stock market in the 1980s and into government bonds. Is that where the money is going right now when it comes out of the stock market? Is it going into government bonds?
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that we're seeing now, and this is one of the things I look at bond yields right now, and I mean the yield curve is really bizarre because you've got short-term rates are fairly high, medium-term rates are low, and then long-term rates get higher again. It's just a bizarre set of interest rates that we have. Usually, what happens with bond yields is that in kind of a normal universe, the shortest term stuff, 28-day T-bills, 4 weeks, 90-day T-bills, 6-month T-bills, these things have the lowest rates. And as you go farther and farther out in duration, 5-year, 10-year, 30-year bonds, the rates get higher and higher. And of course, that makes sense, right? I mean, if you're going to take that risk, if you're going to take risk for 30 years at a fixed rate, that rate should be higher, right? To compensate you for all that, the decades of what might go wrong. And yet you get in these other periods of time where all of a sudden it's the opposite, and the long-term rates are low and the short-term rates are really high. And it's a little bit bizarre, and the market tends to correct that itself. But what ends up happening, especially if people start feeling like, well, recession is in the air, maybe there's going to be a recession, they take their money out of the stock market. And they go and they take that, they've got to put that capital somewhere. And again, for most people, they would just, well, I'll just put it in the bank. But if you have billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, you don't keep that money in the bank. If you're a big fund or a big corporation, you don't keep that money in the bank. You put it in bonds. And the biggest market for bonds happens to be with US government treasuries. And so this is what's happening right now is we're seeing money come out of the stock market and into the bond market. So bonds are becoming more expensive. And what that ultimately means is that yields are falling. And yields, if you look at, for example, like the 10-year yield, the 10-year yield has gotten a lot lower just over the last, month or two. Since, it was actually a problem. Since the election, interest rates are going higher. The Federal Reserve kept saying, we're going to cut rates, we're cutting rates. And it didn't matter. The bond market wasn't listening. The bond market was like, oh, who are you? I don't care what you're saying anymore. And yields kept rising. Now, all of a sudden, with all this talk of recession, you have, and this is just literally, this is kind of a new thing, right? Remember, a year ago, 2 years ago, there was this big fear of recession. And then it went from recession to people started thinking like, maybe we're going to get a soft landing. And then soft landing. Then after the election, they forget about soft landing. There's going to be no landing at all. We're just going to go through the moon. There's going to be no landing at all. Forget about soft landing. There's no landing. And now they kind of come full circle. Now they're back to, oh God, there's going to be a recession. And if there's going to be a recession and you're a big, fund manager, investment banker, that to them is code for, I got to pull my money out of stocks. I got to lock in my gains. I got to pull my money out of the stock market, and I got to do something with this cash. So I'll buy bonds. It creates a lot of demand for bonds. And that means that yields fall. We actually talked about this like a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about like how do interest rates fall? Well, either they have to coax the money out of the bond market, or out of the stock market and into the bond market, or the Federal Reserve has to come in and start printing lots and lots and lots of money. And the Fed hasn't gotten to that level yet, but this talk of recession has scared enough investors to take their money out of stocks and put it into bonds. And so we've seen bond prices rise, i.e. yields fall as a result of that. And I kind of look at that and I go, maybe that was the point.
Maybe that's what you mean when you ask, is this the 4D chess move? Is that because they need bonds yields to fall?
They absolutely need bond yields to fall. And the reason they need bond yields to fall is, as we've talked about, there's $28 trillion of U.S. government bonds that are set to mature over the next 4 years. And most of that $28 trillion carries yields of like 1%, 2%. So you're talking about refinancing 1% paper for 5%, you're a 4% increase in your interest rate on $28 trillion. That's an extra $1 trillion a year in interest that you have to pay. That's enough to bankrupt anybody. And so I think these guys realize that. And so they go, man, we got to get interest rates down. And so they've been, publicly, they've been putting pressure on the Federal Reserve, cut rates. But the only way the Federal Reserve can actually truly cut rates is if they start printing money again. Right? If the Fed prints money and buys bonds, then all that sort of artificial demand for bonds makes yields fall. So interest rates across the board fall. The flip side of that, though, is that all that new money that enters the system becomes very inflationary. So the other way to make yields fall is if they can manage to get the money out of the stock market and into the bond market. How do you do that? By telling people, well, maybe there will be a recession. I don't know. I can't predict these things.
You think they might want to get it out of the way early in the administration so that by like midterms things are on the upswing again?
Maybe so. Maybe that's one of the things that they're looking at. One thing that I think tariffs are a stupid idea. But one thing I actually agree wholeheartely is when they say this economy needs a reset. Reset's a strong word. But I think they're right when they look at it, because so much of the economic growth, I mean, this is something that the media never picked up on during the Biden years. They say, oh, the economy's in great condition. No, it's not. Again, you're getting $1.5 trillion. I mean, at the time, $1.2 trillion in economic growth. And in exchange, you're increasing your debt by $2 trillion, right? It's just completely backwards. Any corporate CEO that was constantly spending more money and getting less and less for it would have been fired a long time ago. But they were taking victory laps about, oh, look at what this great economy is. It was a joke. And that's kind of the reset, is to say you've got to get the economy off of its addiction to government spending. There's way too much government spending. You got to shrink the size of government, and it's ridiculous. They go, oh, these poor bureaucrats in the government, and they're so stressed out, whatever. And it's like, man, I'm stressed out every day of my life. I mean, I run multiple businesses. I cannot even imagine. You've seen these like interviews that Elon does, where he's like, I never sleep. I sleep in the factory. My life sucks. I get up every day and I work and all this stuff. It's like that guy's stressed out every day of his life. And it's like, oh, the poor government worker, all of a sudden they felt a little bit of stress. I think anybody that actually, works and has a demanding job, a lot of people feel stress. School teachers feel stress. I mean, everybody gets stressed out. And so now all of a sudden I'm supposed to feel sad and some level of shame and guilt for some government bureaucrat that's like suddenly stressed out. No, sorry.
Are they going to be more productive in the private economy? Are these government work?
Well, they have to be, because if they're not productive, then they're going to get fired. Right. So, I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, if you're just sucking up oxygen and taking up space, you're going to get fired. That's how it works in the private sector. If you're not adding value in some capacity to whatever organization you're part of, you're gone. In the government, you get promoted, right? I mean, because this is a true thing. We talked about this before. Like in the government, it's so hard to fire people that when you're a supervisor in some place and you're like, oh, I got to get rid of this guy, the only way you can get rid of this person is to promote them. So
they're no longer your problem.
They're no longer your problem. They stop dragging you down. You get somebody that's just this like toxic personality that's going in constantly, accusing you of all that kind of stuff. That now they're going to be the senior director.
He's got the middle management written all over him.
Exactly. You just get rid of that asshole, and now I don't have to worry by promoting them. And it's so backwards. And so like there has to be some level, again, reset's a strong word, but a realignment of sorts back to the private sector. And that part I agree with them. And that's not something that happens necessarily smoothly. And there's a lot of, you can see huge constituency against that. People protesting, people filing lawsuits, the derangement. We talked about this, like, oh my God, I'm not going to show this because it's just ridiculous. But I mean, over the weekend, there are these like topless French women marching on the streets in Paris. And if you're thinking, oh, that sounds great, trust me, you don't want
it's not the right one.
You don't want to see it. And so they're like kind of dressed, partially clad in like Nazi attire, doing these little Heil Musk salutes and stuff
fetishes.
Like that. I mean, like, what kind of a person do you have? I mean, like, do you really, like, you got way too much time on your hands if that's what you're. I mean, it's just the level of derangement about this stuff is like, this is a guy who's I mean, at this point, I mean, Tesla stock is down 50% since the election. I mean, it's like he's now become one of the most widely despised people on the planet. His brand value's falling dramatically, and it's working 7 days a week, round the clock. And look, I don't know anybody like feels bad for Elon Musk. It's hard to feel bad for the richest guy in the world, but at the same time, like, he's put a lot on the line. And his goal is, let's make the government more efficient. Let's get rid of all this stupid stuff they're wasting money on. A lot of bureaucracy.
That's what the Nazis did, right?
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, everything is. That's everything has got to come back to that. And it's like the derangement of people that want to go and attack this guy. And they do. I mean, you were telling me some of these stories I didn't even know. I mean, what was some of the stories? Like, people
burning down these Tesla charging stations. This lady got arrested for throwing Molotov cocktails at Teslas, graffitiing up Tesla dealerships. Just absolute psychopaths out here.
What was
all their hate?
The AR-15 ones?
Oh yeah. In Portland, some guy was shooting an AR-15 at the Tesla dealership.
So these are people on the left. These are people on the left, right? So they're supposed to be pro-environment, ergo pro-electric vehicle, pro-charging station, anti-gun, anti polluting the environment, all this stuff. And like, it's just wanton destruction.
Is this how you protect democracy? Right? The voters have spoken, and we just have to start shooting up Teslas.
Right. We're going to shoot up Tesla dealerships now. I mean, it's the level of derangement. And this is because the guy wants to. I mean, were these people who would have before said, hey, you know what I love? I love government bureaucracy. I mean, like, said nobody ever. Nobody ever said that. Nobody was ever standing in line at the DMV trying to get their driver's license renewed going, you know what? These guys are doing a great. This is a bang up operation right here. We should emulate this across the board. I mean, it's nobody ever said that. But now all of a sudden, these people on the left are so deranged that now they have to go, no, we must defend the bureaucracy. We must defend the swamp. We must defend all these things. And it's like, what is the purpose here? What is your end goal? I don't understand it. I really don't understand it. So the like all those things, I think, yeah, I mean, the level of derangement, maybe it's not surprising, the level of derangement. I mean, at the end of the day, like all those things, they do have an impact on the economy, because the economy for so long has depended on government spending, a really inefficient level of government spending. $2 trillion in debt gets you $1.2 trillion in economic growth. What is the point, right? So you need to get those people out of the way and deliver those people back to the private economy, and let the private economy, let the market sort that out and say, okay, let's figure it out. And, where can somebody actually go and have a job and be more productive? And in the long run, that is a good thing. But yeah, that's not
But the pain in the short term would be from taking away that government spending, which is obviously going to have some effect.
and I think that's what they're kind of starting to acknowledge that right now. And this is where individuals, voters, investors, businesses, the market in general, going, whoa, hey, that's not what I thought I was going to get. I thought I was going to get tax cut bonanza, deregulation, blah, 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 all those things. And, hey, look, we might still see the tax cut bonanza. We might still see, we've seen some level of deregulation. It's still very early days. And we might see a whole lot more. A lot of the stuff gets challenged in court. A lot of the stuff gets shot down. But, I think we can probably see a lot more of that. But, I think people just sort of assumed no way there's going to be a recession back in November when the election results were announced. That people said, no way there's going to be a recession. Stock market shot through the roof, crypto shot through the roof. And all of a sudden, like, reality started to set in a little bit. And these guys are saying, maybe there is gonna, I don't know. I don't want to rule it out.
Speaking of reality, was the stock market pretty overvalued? I mean, we were talking about this back in 2017 about the S&P 500 being overvalued, and it doubled since
we were right. We were simultaneously right and wrong. And absolutely, I'll absolutely admit that. I mean, and kind of the lesson that I've learned over that time is that just because something is expensive doesn't mean it can't stay expensive. Doesn't mean it can't become even more expensive. And the stock market was expensive, and guess what? It became even more expensive. And so it was, and we were saying this even recently, going, well, that's pretty expensive.
Just in dollar terms, or is expensive mean something else with like the?
Yeah, looking at basically at the end of the day, stock markets are valued on how much money investors are willing to pay for every dollar in a company's earnings, or for every dollar in revenue, or every dollar in asset value or book value. And so some of these things, some of these different metrics, I mean, people are familiar obviously with like the price earnings ratio of businesses, the stock price relative to its earnings per share. And so, kind of normal, let's say normal-ish, if you would see 15, 18 times earnings, and say, okay, that's not crazy. When you start seeing, in some companies that were in the hundreds and hundreds of times earnings, even more than 1,000 times earnings, you start looking at going, that's pretty expensive. Another metric that actually is takes into account longer term periods over an entire economic cycle is what's called the cyclically adjusted price earnings, or the Shiller PE ratio. That was something that you could see. I mean, just even a couple of months ago was higher than it had ever been, even higher than during, before the 1929 crash, higher than it had ever been. The only exception being just prior to the dot-com crash in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Do you think that means it's leading to another crash, or?
Well, I mean, it's down right now. The market's down. It's down significantly, but that Shiller PE ratio, even though the market's fallen, like, it's still high. So, but again, like, just because something is expensive doesn't mean it can't stay expensive forever. And you could see, so that in and of itself is not a predictor. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, like if with respect to stocks, if investors are buying into great businesses, what do you really care what the Shiller PE ratio is? If you own shares of a really great business that's doing something that actually matters, that's important, it's developing whatever it is, whether it's really great technology, or just a better way to do something, whatever it is. If you have a really, really great business, from a big picture macro, it doesn't really matter what the Shiller PE ratio is. And there's a lot of great businesses in the United States and around the world that are doing really, really great things, irrespective of what the Shiller, PE ratio is. And that's the thing, is that, the old joke about nobody ever rings a bell at the top. You don't ever really know. We were joking about Tesla stock, right? Tesla was a company that traded, I think, at its peak at like 1,200 times earnings, right? Its PE ratio was 1,200. That's insane. And, if you were somebody that was really focused on that, and you would have been, it's like, how would anybody know? I mean, once it hit 400 times earnings, somebody said, oh, that's crazy, that's way too high. And then it would have tripled from there, right? So somebody had been kind of paying attention to it and said, oh, I got to sell because the PE ratio is too high. The PE ratio got to 400. You would have missed out on 3x at that point. But at the same time, when it got to 1,200, you might be thinking, hey, it's going to double from here. And then it would have lost 75% of its value and then increase, it was just been this roller coaster ride. And that's the point, is that if you're going to be an investor of any kind, I think especially in equities, whether public or private, you've got to be able to stomach those roller coaster rides. And at the end of the day, just know, am I invested in a really great business or not? And you've got to reassess that from time to time, because products change, management change, competition changes, and sometimes, the macro environment changes. Sometimes with a stroke of a pen, legislation changes and a business's fortunes might rise or fall based on that. So you have to make those reassessments from time to time. But, at the end of the day, if you convince yourself, I'm invested in a great business, it's virtually impossible, and to time the highs and lows. And I think everybody's got to have enough discipline and your own set of rules to make a determination of at what point, if something's going up, 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 what point do I want to lock in some gains and take some money off the table? And if something falls, and goes down, 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 do I have some kind of loss mechanism? I trigger some losses and trailing. Everybody's going to have a different approach to that, and I think it makes sense to do that, but view it rationally and not emotionally. And it's easy to get caught up in, I remember during the 2008 financial crisis, and the stock market was going up and down 1,000 points in a day. And that was a roller coaster ride. That was hard. It was so emotional because, that was when 1,000 points was like a really, really big deal. They still today go, oh, the Dow was down 900 points. It's like, it's like 40 something thousand. So big deal. This was back when the market was like 1,000, or sorry, not 1,000, like 14,000. So you lose 1,000 points on a 14,000 point Dow Jones Industrial Average. That's a really big move. It's a huge move. And that was like a daily thing. It was up, it was down. The government would come out and say, oh, we're going to do this. It was back up. And then another bank would fail and it was back down. And then Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Chairman, would come out and say something else. It would be back up again. It was so emotional. And as an investor, you just can't do that.
So the market's not always right. You can't just look to the market to say it's going to be correct.
Completely irrational. Yeah. And so, those are the things. Like, if you're going to be an investor really of any kind, you've got to have those things, thought out in advance. I told this story about this like Delta Force operative who used to talk about pre-made decisions. And he said, they would think about all these things, before an operation, before a mission. They'd think about all these things about, the decisions they would make. If this happens, here's what we're going to do. If this happens, here's what we're going to do. And they would plan all of those things. And that was a really interesting way to look at it. And I think it's actually rather sensible, not only investment strategy, but also life strategy, is to have those kinds of pre-made decisions, to know, here's how I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to act. If the market tanks, if this happens, if that happens, here's how I'm going to react to that. I'm going to make this assessment, then I'm going to do this. That's a very rational outlook, because, you might view it as, hey, the market's down because people are afraid about recession. Does that actually have any impact in this company that I invested in? And if it does, is that like a forever impact, or is that just a, maybe for the next couple of quarters impact? In which case, do I really care? Right. So that's kind of the difference. And again, between big picture, like, is there actually a connection between the stock market and the economy? I would say the economy, for the most part, is actually a much better functioning organism than the market, which is it's like an emotional gland. It's like an adolescent that just, is kind of going from hot and cold, super, super emotional, 14-year-old basically. I think the economy is a much more mentally healthy, functioning adult that is able to withstand a lot of things. And, again, okay, fine. If there's going to be this happens or that happens, it's going to be fine. You're going to absorb 500,000 people into the labor market all of a sudden who are getting fired from their government jobs. Fine, big deal. It's going to become, it'll find a place. The market will find a place. It's going to be okay. This is the the largest and most productive economy in the world, the most dynamic economy in the world. Like, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine with respect to absorbing all that labor and all that. But what we need to see a little bit more of is a little bit more common sense in some of these gyrating government policies. And I think that's what's kind of rightfully freaking a lot of people out.
Well, in regards to investing too, when a market consolidates, if, like you said, if you're in a good company, that company can actually do better during a recession or during a stock market fall sometimes, right? Because it collects some of the competitors that weren't as efficient.
Well,
Is that
that's yeah. I mean, that's the thing in a recession. I mean, in a recession, if there's actually even a little bit of decline in economic output, you'll have some businesses will go under, and the really great businesses will survive and consolidate market share, and they'll actually emerge from that in much better condition. So,
so a
that's
recession is that like tough medicine in some ways that the
hmm?
economy needs to clear out the excesses.
Yeah. I mean, it is. It's the tough medicine that most people haven't. I mean, nobody's really had to take it for a long time. And that's one of the things that didn't happen. I will say that there was a recession in 2022, 2023. I mean, again, it was so obvious that people's standards of living fell. That's a recession. But what they didn't do, the government stepping in and bailing out a lot of things and shoveling all this money into the economy, they didn't really allow the failures to take place to the extent that could have happened. So that malinvestment, just bad ideas, companies that should have never gotten funded, a lot of stuff didn't fail. A lot of stuff didn't end up going to money heaven. And that's something that hasn't happened realistically since the 2008 financial crisis. And in some respects, that's long overdue. And what governments often, politicians do, is they step in and they just try and inflate that bubble even more and kick the can down the road because nobody wants to get blamed for a recession. So, maybe these guys are sort of at peace with that and said, screw it, let's just have our recession, be done with it, and move on. And maybe they're trying to make that, as you said, maybe they're trying to make that as early as possible in their administration so that in a couple of years they can get, take all the credit for whatever boom might take place. But, at the same time, I still think that tariffs are a terrible idea. And so,
Well, I was going to ask, is this like a 1-2 punch combo? So you have all these people now looking for a job, and then you apply tariffs, and now all these things have to be made in the U.S. So now are the government bureaucrats going to be making socks and underwear
right?
instead of
Yeah.
Bangladesh?
I was watching this video. And I don't know. People send me weird stuff all the time. For some reason, somebody sent me a video of like a surgeon, and it was like with his like little surgical tools folding this teensy tiny little piece of paper, and like the precision with which he was able to do that. And basically, it was like this tiny little like origami thing in the very end. And it was like something was like the size of a postage stamp with his surgical tools. It's like, okay, that's very impressive. So let's look at those as an example. Like on one hand, you could be a surgeon, and if you're somebody, you're doing brain surgery, like that's a pretty expensive thing, right? And it's expensive because it's like really valuable. There's just supply and demand. There's like not a lot of people that can do that, and like you can do that, and so you can command lots and lots and lots of money and stand there for a couple of hours and do brain surgery and make lots and lots and lots of money. On the other hand, you have this skill with your hand where you can take some tiny little instruments and make this tiny little postage stamp size origami. And so maybe instead you decide that's going to be your vocation in life, is I'm going to make this postage stamp size origami, and I can go and sell this stuff, make this handmade origami and go and sell it to, whatever, Walmart and Target for like a couple dollars a piece. Okay. So maybe you make a living doing that, right? But you're going to clearly make a lot more money being a brain surgeon, not being the kind of the tiny origami guy, right? There's just not as much money in that. You sell it for a couple of bucks, you make a little bit of money, but it's just nowhere near the amount of money as being a brain surgeon. And if you think about that example from an economic perspective, right? You have some economies in the world that can be the brain surgery economy, right? Because they have, I don't mean brain surgery in general, but I mean, things that are really valuable, the technology and different high value services and those sorts of things that are really, really, really valuable. And we know it's valuable because that's what money is for. Money tells us what's valuable. Money is a measurement of economic value. Something that is more expensive has more value than something that's very inexpensive, right? So the US and other developed countries have the ability to do those really valuable things. Like in this little example, brain surgery. There are other countries, their economies aren't as developed. And so they don't have the ability. They're not the brain surgery economies. They're not the high value products and services. They're not the AI economies. They're the little trinket piece of paper origami economies. They're the bend over in the fields and plant turnips economy. They're manufacturing socks and underwear, things that just aren't that valuable. How do we know they're not valuable? Because you can go to the store and buy some for $5. versus spending tens of thousands of dollars on, whatever other, product or service of these sorts of things that can be produced in the US economy. That's ultimately what drives prosperity, is people doing the most valuable things that they can do. And that works at an individual level as well as a macro level. If you had, I'm an NFL guy, right? So we can only imagine, like, if maybe Patrick Mahomes would be the best guy in the world at sacking groceries. You get, like, he's throwing watermelons in the bag, faster than anybody else, and he's like the best grocery sacker in the history of the world. Maybe like Messi would be like this amazing, construction worker or whatever. Like, but we'll never know because that dude's playing soccer, and Patrick Mahomes is a quarterback in the National Football League because they're doing the things that they are the best at. This is the whole point. It's like you should do what is your best and highest use. And if you're a brain surgeon, that's your best and highest use. Even if you're able to make these little paper, tiny origami things, your best and highest use is brain surgery because it's so much more valuable. The U.S. economy's best and highest use is not making socks and underwear. It's doing these other things that are so much more valuable. So
what do you think the U.S. should be focused on?
Well, these things that are really valuable. I mean, I mean, the U.S. is actually capable of so many things. Right. But it's just to all of a sudden say, we're going to slap tariffs on socks and underwear that's made in XYZ country because we're going to start making socks and underwear over here, damn it. And so all that happens is people now are doing things that make them worse off because now the economy is not operating at its best and highest use. It's doing things that are really kind of beneath the status of the economy and what it's capable of. And anytime you consistently underperform your potential, it's like being a guy who's a brain surgeon and yet, hung up his surgical tools to go and make little paper trinkets that you can sell for $5. It's just maybe it's a personal decision. That's great. But your life is definitely your prosperity is going to decline dramatically.
But for the U.S. as a whole, if we're trying to develop leading artificial intelligence and automation, but we have to essentially stop and go pick turnips and go make socks.
Make socks and underwear.
Saying that it's not going to be as much.
That's a decline in prosperity. That's a decline in prosperity. If you want to take Lionel Messi and make him sack groceries at the grocery store, that's a decline. That's a decline in prosperity. I mean, you take an economy that's capable of doing so much more, and you say, no, let's do this thing that's way below your potential. Everybody's worse off as a result of that, and that's one of the impacts of tariffs. I mean, it's kind of interesting. If you look at tariff history, the U.S. had tariffs for a while. They hit a low in the mid 1800s. They started going up again kind of during the Civil War. As a big tariff in 1861. After World War I, there were some tariffs. After World War I, the world kind of, I mean, in order to pay like war reparations and war debt and all these sorts of things, the only way that could actually be done was by trading goods and services or gold. Most places didn't have enough gold. So they had to pay in goods and services, basically. It created trade imbalances and all of that. And they started with some tariffs. There was one called the Fordney-Macumber tariff that was like completely stupid in the early 1920s. And then you got to the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff. And the Smoot-Hawley tariff was really interesting because this was at a time where the U.S. did have a lot of technological superiority over the rest of the world, simply because the U.S. was so electrified. The U.S. had a lot more electricity per capita, per household, per state, per square mile than most other countries did. And because of that, they had major industrial advantages. Electricity was cheaper, all these different things that they had. So they had huge competitive advantages. And tariffs actually ended up making things a lot worse. The reason why is because you didn't need tariffs to stimulate the domestic production. The U.S. already had a lot of advantages. But they wanted to have these tariffs to protect U.S. workers and protect the economy and all these sorts of things. You didn't need it because the economy already had those advantages. What ended up happening was that other countries said, oh, you're going to do that to us, then we're going to do that to you. And so tariffs around the world started increasing. There were retaliatory tariffs, and it made it then very, very expensive to import U.S. products and services. So basically, U.S. trade collapsed. And all this money that could have been made from U.S. companies that were manufacturing, that had competitive advantages in manufacturing, they could have made a lot more money by exporting to the rest of the world. And yet, all of a sudden, France and Germany, all these places imposed all these tariffs on U.S. products. as a retaliation for the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And this just, everybody was worse off, and is one of the things that really exacerbated the effects of the Great Depression. You have similar circumstances right now in that, we kind of joke about socks and underwear, but there is a case to be made that the U.S. actually can be a manufacturing powerhouse, including in basic items like socks and underwear, things that are just so. And the reason why is because you have automation innovation in the US, you have the AI innovation, you've got high performance computing, quantum computing, all these innovations in the United States that are just off the charts. You have the potential for nuclear power everywhere, so you can have this ultra cheap, super abundant energy source that's powering automation and AI, that's able to create these huge competitive advantages in various manufacturing, including basic stuff like socks and underwear. And it's crazy to think that in the United States, there is a day that can come in the relatively near future where they'll be able to manufacture just about anything. They'll be able to
So one
manufacture.
human overseeing an entire factory that currently oversees employs 1,000 sweatshop workers. Next thing we know, we'll see the left coming out in favor of sweatshops, of course. But
You could be right. Yeah. But I mean, yeah, that's what it is. I mean, you're talking about a very small number of human beings overseeing a large manufacturing operation that is largely controlled by AI and robotics and powered by cheap and abundant nuclear fuel and all. I mean, and because of that, your cost to manufacture just about anything go down to almost nothing. And then you're able to 3D print a lot of source material and all this different stuff. I mean, and that day is not that far off. It's really not that far off. And that sort of thing is why, I mean, there are countries in the world that just don't have that capability, right? There are countries around the world. I mean, I think about, there are places, especially in Latin America, whether in Puerto Rico or whatever. I mean, Panama, Mexico, they have like big like call center economies because they have bilingual people. It's Spanish speaking, English speaking. And so they do these call centers there. Like that stuff's going away. That stuff's going away real fast. All of it's going to get replaced by AI. And there's so many literal entire economies, they're manufacturing economies that are just going to get washed away because of the availability of cheap and abundant energy, because of automation in factories, because of AI, because of all these things. They're like, we're not talking about industries and some jobs that are going to be lost. We're talking about entire economies. They're going to be washed away. But that doesn't apply to the U.S. The U.S. is going to be the source of that stuff. And there's going to be people that are going to, they'll have to find new jobs. There's going to be, different things that happen. But as an overall economy, I mean, the U.S. can become this manufacturing powerhouse, this energy supply powerhouse, there's all these things. And you don't need tariffs for that. You don't need to have tariffs to bring back manufacturing to the United States. All you need is the technology that says my factory can do better than your factory that's got 600 workers. Well, we're going to be able to do that. I can push a button and do all that stuff here. And that's a really, really, really powerful competitive advantage. And this is what's absolutely possible in the United States. You don't need tariffs.
This sounds
for that.
way easier than trying to go into the weeds as a government and be like, well, we'll tariff this, we'll do that, we'll do taxes. It's just macro. It's just let the economy do what it was already doing. Let the economy do its thing.
Yeah, I want to end with like, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but I'm 46. My grandparents, who are long since departed, they were part of that greatest generation, right? And my grandfather came of age. He was born in I want to say 1915, 1917. I mean, he came of age in the Great Depression. And, they came from a generation. I mean, it's always interesting to think about like the generational constructs. They watched all these banks fail. They watched people lose their life savings in banks and the stock market and all these things that took place. They came up in an era where there was nothing. You wasted nothing. They did. I mean, they basically just learned to do everything themselves. It's like, why would you go to the grocery store and buy food when you can plant it right there? I mean, they just learned to do that because it's like, why spend money if you can just go and put the work in and do that yourself? Why would you buy a house when you can just build one? You just use your hands. God gave you these hands. Use the hands and go and build your own house. I mean, like that's the cloth that they were cut from. And for their entire lives. I mean, it was funny. Like I remember when I was a kid, And my mom used to like joke about this. I mean, the worst thing in the world, the most irritating thing in the world was, when my grandparents would come to visit and we would go out to like lunch or something like that. Oh, did my grandfather, he was like furious about that. And we would go to some place and he would just sit there and he'd have like a cup of coffee and he wouldn't order anything because he's like, why am I going to order some food from a restaurant? It's like that sort of thing. And he would basically, because he knew like there would be like, I'm 8 years old. Like I'm not going to eat all my food, so that he would go and eat off of my plate, and eat off of my mom's plate and stuff like that. It's like, why am I going to pay for a meal? I'm just going to eat this stuff that's going to go to waste. And, for his entire life, like their concept of investing for him, it's like they never had they wouldn't use banks. He'd save his money in like old coffee can. I mean, that like kind of classic, that was their generation. He'd save money in a little coffee can. He planted all of his food. Every house he ever lived in, he built with his own hands. And when he had enough money in the coffee can, what did they do? They went out and bought some more land. They bought a piece of land. And then they would go, and in the meantime, they would plant more stuff on the land. They would go and sell the food they made on the land. And when they had more money in the coffee can, they would go out and they would buy some material and they would build a house on that, and then they would rent it out. And my grandparents are like the living embodiment of monopoly. They would just keep buying more land. By the time they passed, they had a whole complex of houses and stuff they were renting out. And the moral of the story is, in all that, they were very enterprising, industrious people, but they weren't special. That was just their generation. That was a generation. And the last thing they would ever if you told my grandfather, like, hey, there's this great stock you should get, he would like, are you a crazy person to invest in the stock market? He wouldn't even put his money in a bank. He put his money in something that he understood, which was land, and then he would rely on himself to go and create some value out of that and build houses that he could then rent out. Like that's the thing that he understood. And my grandmother, one of the houses they built, they used like a small, very small one they used as like an office, because they were, they had so many units at that point and they had needed a place to work out of. And my grandmother, productive as she was, turned part of it into a beauty salon. My grandmother never went to cosmetology school. My grandmother didn't have a license to do anything like that. She just put the shingle out and said, yeah, I can do your hair, I can do your nails. And she built up the skills and the reputation, and she became this sought out lady. If you wanted to do your hair and nails, people go to my grandmother. She didn't have a license. She didn't pass any state inspection. She didn't have to pay some hefty fee. She just started doing people's hair and nails. And that's ultimately what drives productivity, is when the government just gets out of the way. And when you drop the barriers to entry, and this is the thing that's all across government in the land of the free, state governments, local governments, federal governments, armies and legions of inspectors and bureaucrats that have to create these barriers. You want to start a restaurant? Back in my grandparents' day, you needed food. You needed a stove. Like that's what you needed. Now you've got
my mom's grandparents did that, and rumor has it in the family that they started by feeding some construction workers, and then it was like, hey, we should start doing this.
We should do this. Yeah. Right. That's what you used to be able to do. And again, there are some vocations that you don't really need any regulation. Again, if you want to be a butt selfie Instagram model, you don't need any license for that. But God help if you want to start a restaurant today. In 2025, if you want to start a restaurant, then especially depending on where you are. I mean, again, oh my God, I can't even imagine if you want to do this in the state of California. And then you have to put up with all the stuff, and people come in and steal all your food. You have to go, well, we just have to let them steal all the food because that's the law. We have to let the thieves run wild. We have to do all these things, whatever. I mean, they've made it so difficult to do business, and they've done it. It's like inflation. It's this slowly, gradually robbing people of their freedom, in the same way that inflation slowly, gradually robs people of their purchasing power, little by little increments, 2%. And I think the regulatory bureaucracy framework works like inflation, where you lose 2% of your freedom every year. With inflation, you lose 2% of your purchasing power every single year. And after a while, you don't even remember anymore. And I'm 46, and like I remember listening to my grandfather's like, oh, we used to, gas, 10 cents for this. Or like, I don't even have a concept of that, because I wasn't even alive when the money was actually worth something. And I think people today, most people weren't even alive. Like we can tell these folk stories about when you used to be able to open up a beauty salon because you had a hair dryer and a comb. and that's all you needed. And like to us, those are just folk stories. Nobody alive today really has any
That's why
recollection
I
of what
want to
it was
see the
like.
I want to see the Trump administration get more aggressive on the deregulation. I feel like that could be huge.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah. I mean, it could be. And instead, I think they're going and doing the opposite with this tariff stuff, because tariffs, again, you look at tariff history, you look at Smoot-Hawley, you look at Ford v. Montgomery, like there's just so many different examples of people literally not getting rich off of tariffs. Because, oh, we're going to get so rich off tariffs. You're not going to get rich off of tariffs if you have a 25% tariff across the board on $3.3 trillion in goods and services. In theory, you make couple $100 billion a year, and that moves the needle. But you're not accounting for fraud. You're not accounting for all of the bootleggers and the rum runners that are going to come illegally importing socks and underwear into America without paying the tariffs. All those sorts of things. And you're not accounting for, most importantly, the economic inefficiencies that come from forcing people to do things that are below their best and highest use, forcing an economy to do below its best and highest use. Again, it's like whatever, Patrick Mahomes, Tom Cruise, Lionel Messi, whatever person you can think of who's at the top of his or her game, sacking groceries instead of doing whatever it is they do, clearly below their best and highest use, clearly underperforming their potential. That's essentially what tariffs force the U.S. economy into, operating below its maximum potential, nowhere near its maximum potential, and that's costly for everybody. Versus the other approach is get the hell out of the way, let people produce freely, embrace these cheap and abundant energy sources like nuclear power, especially the small-scale nuclear reactors. You've got automation in the works, you've got AI in the works. This is realistically a couple years away from having what I call that Star Trek economy, where you have an incredible amount of prosperity, an incredible amount of abundance. That is not that far off if they would just get the hell out of the way and let the private economy do its thing.
I think that's a good place to end it.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, man. Thanks for the conversation.